The house was quiet in a way that felt almost unreal, the kind of silence that comes before something changes, and Emily Carter felt it as she stood near the window of her Vermont home, watching fallen leaves slide across the driveway while the evening light faded. She had lived in this house for more than 20 years, raised her son here, laughed and cried here, and after her husband passed away, this place became both her shelter and her cage, because everything in it reminded her of the life she once had and the life she gave up to be a strong mother. Daniel, her son, had been her whole world since the funeral, and she had poured every bit of love, time, and patience into raising him, believing that sacrifice was the purest form of love. Daniel grew into a quiet but intense young man, thoughtful, responsible, and deeply attached to her, and people often praised Emily for raising such a devoted son, but no one saw how that devotion slowly turned into something heavier, something harder to name. On this evening, Emily held her phone in her hand, reading a short message that made her heart beat faster in a way she had almost forgotten. It was from Michael, a widower she met at a community fundraiser, a man who spoke gently, listened carefully, and never rushed her feelings. Their messages were simple, nothing dramatic, just shared memories, soft jokes, and understanding words, yet for Emily, they felt like a door opening after years of darkness. She smiled to herself, a small, private smile, the kind that belongs only to someone rediscovering hope, and for a moment she felt young again, not in age but in spirit. She locked her phone and placed it on the table as she heard Daniel's footsteps coming down the stairs, his presence filling the room before he even spoke, and she straightened her posture out of habit, the way she always did when he entered, not because she feared him, but because she had grown used to adjusting herself around his moods. Daniel greeted her politely, asked about dinner, and moved around the kitchen with ease, yet his eyes lingered on her face longer than usual, as if searching for something she hadn't said. Emily felt a strange tension but brushed it aside, telling herself she was overthinking, because Daniel had always been protective, always alert, especially when it came to her. As they ate, the conversation stayed light, but underneath it, something felt unsettled, like a calm surface hiding a strong current. Daniel mentioned how busy work had been, how he worried about her being alone too much, how neighbors could not always be trusted, and Emily nodded, listening, as she had done for years, but inside she felt a quiet resistance growing. After dinner, Daniel casually mentioned a name, Michael, and the sound of it landed heavily between them. Emily looked up, surprised, asking how he knew that name, and Daniel replied calmly that he had seen a message pop up on her phone earlier when she left it on the counter. The room seemed to shrink, and Emily felt a wave of discomfort she couldn't immediately explain, not because she had done something wrong, but because something private had been noticed without her consent. Daniel asked questions that sounded like concern but felt more like judgment, wanting to know who Michael was, how long they had been talking, and why she hadn't told him, and Emily answered carefully, choosing her words like stepping stones across thin ice. She said Michael was a friend, someone kind, someone who understood loss, and as she spoke, she realized how long it had been since she had talked about her own feelings out loud. Daniel listened, but his expression hardened, and he said he didn't like the idea of a stranger entering her life, especially after everything she had been through. Emily reminded him gently that she was not fragile, that she had survived heartbreak before, but Daniel's response came quickly, sharper than she expected, saying that people always hurt those who trust too easily. The words stayed with her, because she could hear fear behind them, fear of change, fear of losing control over the world he had built around her. Emily felt a quiet ache in her chest, realizing that her son, the boy she once held during thunderstorms, now saw himself as her shield, her gatekeeper, and maybe even her judge. She ended the conversation softly, saying she was tired and needed rest, and Daniel accepted that, though his eyes lingered with unspoken thoughts as he walked away. Alone again, Emily sat at the table, staring at her hands, feeling a mix of guilt and sadness that surprised her, because she had done nothing wrong, yet she felt as though she had crossed a line simply by wanting something more from life. She thought about the years she spent setting aside her own dreams to make sure Daniel felt safe and loved, and she wondered when love had turned into obligation, and when protection had started to feel like a boundary closing in. Outside, the wind grew stronger, shaking the windows gently, and Emily felt the same unease inside her, sensing that something important had shifted between her and her son. She picked up her phone again, reading Michael's message one more time, and for the first time, she hesitated before replying, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that her choice would not only affect her heart, but also the fragile balance of her family. As she finally typed a short reply, her hand steady but her heart unsure, Emily understood that the quiet life she had known was ending, and that a line, once sacred and unspoken, had already begun to blur, even though neither she nor Daniel was ready to admit how close they were to crossing it. After that evening, something changed in the house, not loudly but deeply, as if an unseen weight had settled into every room, and Emily felt it each morning when she woke and each night when she tried to sleep. Daniel became more watchful, more present, always asking where she was going, who she had spoken to, and when she would return, framing every question as care but never as a choice. Emily tried to keep life normal, going to work, shopping for groceries, watering the garden, yet Daniel's attention followed her like a shadow, and she began to notice how often he checked her phone when it buzzed, how he paused near her laptop when emails were open, how his silence felt louder than words. Michael's messages remained gentle and respectful, but Emily now read them with caution, aware that even small moments of happiness could bring tension into her home. When Daniel spoke about Michael, his tone was firm and dismissive, saying the man was a distraction, a risk, someone who could take advantage of her kindness, and Emily listened, feeling both anger and sorrow, because she recognized that Daniel's fear came from love, yet love had started to bend into something unhealthy. One afternoon, Emily returned home earlier than expected and found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in his hand, scrolling through her messages, and the shock of that moment cut through her calm like cold air. She asked him to stop, her voice steady but firm, and Daniel looked up, unashamed, saying he only wanted to make sure she was safe. That word, safe, echoed in her mind, because safety without trust felt like a locked door. Emily took her phone back, reminding him that privacy mattered, that she was still an adult with her own life, but Daniel responded by listing everything he had done for her since his father died, every sacrifice, every choice, every moment he stayed instead of leaving, and she felt a quiet guilt settle in, even though she knew love should not be counted like debts. Days later, Emily planned to meet Michael for coffee at a public cafe, nothing private, nothing rushed, and when Daniel found out, he tried to stop her, standing by the door and asking her to reconsider, saying he had a bad feeling, saying he didn't trust this man, saying the world was not kind to women like her. Emily looked at her son and saw fear behind his words, but she also saw control, and for the first time, she said no, gently but clearly. The meeting with Michael was calm and respectful, filled with quiet conversation and shared memories of loss, and Emily felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years, not excitement, but understanding. When she returned home, Daniel's mood was cold, his words short, and later that night she overheard him on the phone, speaking sharply, using Michael's name, telling someone to stay away from his family, and Emily's heart dropped as she realized he had crossed another boundary without asking. She confronted Daniel, asking if he had contacted Michael, and after a moment of silence, he admitted it, saying he had warned the man not to confuse her kindness for interest, and Emily felt hurt in a way that went beyond anger, because her voice had been taken from her own story. She told Daniel that his behavior was not protection but interference, that love did not give him the right to decide her future, and Daniel responded with emotion, saying he could not lose her, saying he felt replaced, saying the thought of another man in her life made him feel invisible. Emily listened, tears forming, realizing how deeply tangled their lives had become, how grief had shaped their bond in ways neither of them had noticed until now. She reminded him that a mother's love does not disappear when she chooses happiness, that her heart had space for both him and someone new, but Daniel struggled to accept this truth, his fear turning into silence. Over the following weeks, he began canceling plans she made, offering excuses, suggesting she rest instead of go out, discouraging her gently but persistently, and Emily felt her world shrink as she noticed how easily she had begun adjusting her choices to avoid conflict. One evening, alone in her room, she looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, a woman who had survived loss, raised a child alone, and yet now felt unsure about claiming her own life. That realization was painful but clear, the line between care and control had been crossed, and if she did not face it soon, she would lose not only the chance at love, but also herself. And as she sat on the edge of the bed, holding her phone and staring at Michael's unread message, Emily understood that the next step she took would either restore balance, or break the fragile peace of her family forever. The truth revealed itself on a quiet afternoon when Emily returned home earlier than usual. And felt an unease she could not explain, the house too still, the air too heavy, and as she walked past Daniel's room, she noticed papers spread across his desk, something white catching her eye, and when she stepped closer, her heart sank because it was a printed email she had written to Michael, words meant to be private, words filled with honesty and careful hope. In that moment, the weight of everything she had ignored pressed down on her, and she realized this was no longer about concern or fear but about control over her thoughts and feelings. She stood there for a long time, holding the paper, breathing slowly, choosing calm over anger, because she knew shouting would only deepen the damage already done. When Daniel came home later that evening, Emily was waiting at the kitchen table, the paper folded neatly in front of her, and the look on his face told her he understood before she said a word. She asked him how long he had been reading her private messages, and after a pause filled with shame, he admitted he had accessed her email, saying he needed to understand what she was thinking, what she was planning, who she was becoming. Emily felt a deep sadness, not just for herself, but for the son she had raised, because she could see how fear had twisted his sense of love into something harmful. She told him calmly that what he had done broke her trust, that privacy was not a luxury but a right, and that love without respect could not survive. Daniel's voice shook as he tried to explain, saying he felt like he was losing her, that since his father's death, she had been the only steady thing in his life, the only place that felt safe, and the idea of her building a life that did not revolve around him filled him with panic. Emily listened, tears in her eyes, understanding his pain but refusing to excuse his actions, because she knew that understanding did not mean acceptance. She told him he was her son, not her partner, not her guardian, and that he could not take ownership of her heart simply because he feared being alone. Those words hurt him deeply, and he turned away, struggling to hold himself together, finally admitting that he did not know who he was without her constant presence. The confession broke something open between them, and for the first time, Emily saw how their shared grief had trapped them in roles that no longer fit. She explained that her desire for companionship did not erase her love for him, that there was room for growth without loss, but Daniel could not yet see it, his emotions clouded by years of silent dependency. The conversation stretched late into the night, filled with pauses, tears, and heavy truths neither of them had wanted to face, and when it ended, nothing felt resolved, only exposed. Over the next few days, the house felt fragile, as if one wrong word could cause everything to collapse, and Daniel avoided her, spending long hours away or locked in his room, while Emily moved through her routines with a quiet determination forming inside her. She knew now that avoiding conflict had only allowed the problem to grow, and that love sometimes required painful honesty. One morning, she told Daniel she needed space, not as punishment, but as a step toward healing, explaining that she could not continue living under watch, and that he needed to learn who he was beyond being her protector. The words were hard, but necessary, and Daniel reacted with disbelief, then anger, then silence, before finally nodding, his face drained of color as he understood the seriousness of her decision. He agreed to move out temporarily, saying little, packing his things slowly, each movement heavy with regret. As Emily watched him leave, her heart ached, but she also felt a quiet sense of strength return, because she had finally spoken the truth out loud. That evening, alone in the house, she sat by the window, the same place where this journey had begun, and for the first time in months, she felt clarity instead of fear, knowing the line that had been crossed could not be ignored, and that healing, if it came at all, would begin only after both of them learned to let go of the roles that had kept them trapped for far too long. Time moved forward in quiet, steady steps after Daniel left the house, and the silence that once felt heavy slowly began to feel honest, giving Emily space to breathe, think, and remember who she was before grief and responsibility shaped every choice she made. The first weeks were difficult, filled with moments where she almost reached for her phone to check on Daniel, to fix things, to ease his discomfort, but she stopped herself each time, understanding that love did not always mean rescue. She focused on small routines, morning walks, cooking meals just for herself, meeting friends she had quietly drifted away from over the years, and in those simple acts, she felt parts of herself return. Michael remained patient and respectful, never pushing, never asking for more than she could give, and their conversations became a source of calm rather than conflict, built on honesty and shared understanding. Meanwhile, Daniel struggled in his new space, facing long nights where he could no longer measure his worth by how close he stayed to his mother, and for the first time, he began to see how much of his identity had been tied to control rather than growth. He started counseling, not because Emily demanded it, but because he finally felt the cost of his actions, the loneliness that came from crossing a line he could not undo. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Daniel reached out, not with accusations or fear, but with apologies that sounded real. Admitting he had confused love with possession and protection with power. Emily listened carefully, choosing patience over bitterness, and when they met again, it was in a public place, neutral and calm, where both of them could speak freely without falling into old patterns. Their conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but grounded in mutual respect, and Emily made her boundaries clear, not as walls, but as guides for a healthier relationship. Daniel accepted them, understanding now that closeness did not mean control, and that letting go was part of growing up. Over time, trust began to rebuild, not as it once was, but as something stronger and more balanced, shaped by awareness and choice rather than fear. Emily allowed herself to move forward with her life, embracing companionship without guilt, rediscovering joy without apology, and Daniel learned to build a future that did not depend on holding someone else still. One spring morning, months after the separation, they sat together on Emily's porch, sharing coffee under soft sunlight, the air filled with quiet understanding rather than tension. They spoke easily, laughed softly, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt the need to guard the moment. Emily looked at her son and saw not a frightened boy clinging to the past, but a young man learning to stand on his own, and Daniel looked at his mother and saw not someone he needed to protect, but a woman strong enough to choose her own happiness. The sacred line that had once been crossed now stood clear and respected, not because it was forced, but because both of them understood why it mattered. As the morning passed, Emily felt peace settle in her heart, knowing that love could survive mistakes if it was willing to change, and that healing did not mean returning to what was familiar, but building something better from the truth, one honest step at a time.